Friends. Today we are going to be talking about some of the conditions that emerged in the colonies in the 1600s and 1700s. And it occurs to me that this is really our first sort of lecture. So, when we lecture, I call these essential questions, meaning it is the topic of the lecture, something that we hope we can answer by the time we're done. I'm going to encourage you to have a notebook that you take your lecture notes in. I think that that's really helpful, and that'll be like this common place for you to gather all this information. And so our essential question for today is, what challenges emerged in the 1600s and 1700s that led to both an internal strife and a shift in the dynamic between the colonies and Great Britain? So the first sort of big topic that I want to address is really for us to examine the relationship between Great Britain and her colonies. We kind of need to go back a little bit and think about the purpose of the colonies. And the purpose of Great Britain, even getting colonies, is to create an empire. We'll be talking a little bit more about this concept of imperialism later on in this course, but realize that idea of building an empire or expanding the strength and power of one's colony or one's country is sort of at the heart of what it is that Great Britain is doing by allowing all these colonies to go to North America. And make no mistake, we seem to oftentimes treat these colonies that are settling in North America as if somehow these are just a bunch of free and independent folks making some decisions. But at the end of the day, it is Great Britain that is allowing such behavior to happen. So let's just not forget that, okay? And part of that is because of this concept called mercantilism. Sometimes you hear it called mercantilism, and sometimes you hear it called mercantilism. And either way, quite frankly, it doesn't matter to me since I've heard it from historians both ways. But mercantilism is this belief that the more gold a country has, the more power it has. And as a result, they will be able to, the country that has the most gold will be able to create influence. And we have to remember, and we need to put this kind of set it in the times of Europe. So in the 1400s, 1500s, and 1600s, Great Britain feels very much in competition with neighboring countries like Spain and France. Germany's not a country at this time. It's just a series of like states is the best way to think about it. But there's this huge sense of competition between Great Britain, France, and Spain. And that is largely because they are all close to each other. They all have kings and queens. And there's a sense that one needs to be more powerful than another. There's not this sense that like somehow they can just live amongst each other without an issue. And so mercantilism really drives and is at the heart of this philosophy of getting colonies. So if gold is your goal, if you're Great Britain, then absolutely, plant those colonies where you will, because hopefully you'll be able to gather some gold and some wealth in other forms, like Virginia, which is tobacco. And that will allow the country to expand its influence. However, I think we have to identify a couple things, and we need to talk about this first period of salutary neglect. Salutary neglect, sort of at its heart, really means like friendly neglect, meaning like Great Britain isn't intentionally disregarding its colonies. It's that it has other things going on. So think of salutary neglect as like, there's this disregard or ignoring of this entire population in North America because things in Great Britain are really tense and their country is trying to deal with some political issues. And the very first period of salutary neglect takes place between 1640 to 1670. And during this time, there is this revolt that happens. Scotland revolts under Charles I. There's an Irish Catholic rebellion. In 1642, the king raises an army, and Parliament raises an army, and they go to war with each other. And the war ends in 1649 with the king being beheaded, and England becomes this commonwealth, which is basically like a republic, kind of like what we are today in the United States. They have somebody who's put in charge. His name is Oliver Cromwell. I'm not wanting you to get into the details of all of that, but Cromwell dies in 1658, and like this whole concept of a commonwealth completely falls away. king comes to power. His name is Charles II, and this is nicknamed in European history in Great Britain called the Restoration. And he really had like no patience for religious dissenters. So now we're going to kind of click this back to knowledge we've talked about. He doesn't care for Catholics. He doesn't like Presbyterians. He doesn't like Baptists. He doesn't like Quakers. And so, in fact, because he doesn't like these religious populations, he is fine with them wanting to flee to North America to live in the colonies there, right? Basically, like they're out of his way. He doesn't have to worry about them. And then that way, in his mind, Great Britain, or England in particular, can be for those who are practicing members of the Church of England, otherwise called the Anglican Church. So at this point in time, like Charles II gets really serious and decides that he is going to create a series of acts and start regulating the colonies again, trying to end this period of salutary neglect. And the Navigation Acts are such acts. So what the Navigation Acts do is they create this really like tense environment which regulates trade between the colonies and Great Britain. And there's 3 of them, and I'm not going to hold you accountable to them by any means, but recognize that they say that certain goods, what they call enumerated goods, that certain goods could only be traded into the ports of Great Britain, meaning they couldn't go anywhere else in Europe. And tobacco was an example of that. So tobacco coming out of Maryland and Virginia absolutely had to go to England. And then England, or Great Britain, could sell tobacco as they wanted to. But Virginia and Maryland can't like put it on a ship and send it to Spain or anything like that. It says that, the colonies are only to be working with ships that are made either in the colonies or from Great Britain. The crews on the ships have to be from the colonies or from Great Britain. So there's these sort of like locking down, if you will, of behaviors specifically related to trade between Great Britain and the colonies. Why? Take it back to the concept of mercantilism, because this allows Great Britain an opportunity to restore its economic power, which is going to give them influence in Europe. However, you should know that Charles II didn't last very long. He wasn't very popular. And so in 1688, there is what is called the Glorious Revolution, which is when there are some leaders who are actually from the Netherlands by the name of William and Mary. There's a college in the United States called William and Mary. There are these leaders by the name of William and Mary, and they are basically invited to come and rule England. Charles II was not very popular. James II, who preceded him or succeeded him, was also not very popular. So to be invited to come rule a country like William and Mary should indicate to you just how desperate some people were to get rid of James II and the effects of Charles II. During this, though, I think we have to talk about some things that happen. Please don't expect that the people in the colonies have a whole lot of idea of what's going on back in Great Britain. So this whole concept of like a glorious revolution, it comes late. They're not texting each other to say, hey, just get heads up, breaking news. In fact, the colonies don't even know that the Glorious Revolution has happened. They have no idea who William and Mary are at the time. They are just living under this sort of strict thumb of Charles II and James II. Charles II and James II like shut down any liberties that existed. They shut down these sort of like, sort of congresses, quasi-congresses that the colonists have established. They shut down all the charters that were established at the time of the settling or planting of the colonies that would have sort of allowed for like a democratic process for voting, et cetera. So all of that kind of ends. And it's just really kind of ugly in the American colonies. Why? Because salutary neglect has ended. And Great Britain was really interested in making sure that they had a lot of control over the colonies. And we see some examples of just sort of the spinning sense of lack of control that emerges in the colonies. Leisler's Rebellion is an example of that. Leisler's Rebellion is out of New York. It is a man who is really, really angry that The state house in New York has been shut down. And so he leads an uprising. He's demanding liberties. And his rebellion is completely shut down by the British government, the British leaders that are there in New York at that time. But it speaks to the fact that these people in the colonies are really starting to want some sense of control over their own destiny, and kind of aching to be away from Great Britain. The Salem witch trials are another example of that. You're probably familiar with the Salem witch trials to some extent, but they do indicate to us that there's some economic conditions that are emerging in Massachusetts Bay Colony, and as a result, some things are really unsettled. And that kind of moves to my next point, which is to say, okay, as William and Mary kind of come to power, and eventually the colonists hear of this, things kind of calm down a little bit. But nonetheless, there is still internal strife that emerges within the colonies, and internal meaning problems that exist because of actions in the colonies, not impacted specifically by what's going on in England. We've been learning a little bit about Bacon's Rebellion and the significance of this. Bacon's Rebellion is an internal issue, right? It doesn't really have a whole lot to do with what's going on in England per se. I highlight here the House of Burgesses. That is what we call the Congress that existed in Virginia. And there are times in this early colonial history where the House of Burgesses is allowed to exist. It is a representative type government where somebody would come from a community and go serve in the House of Burgesses. The best thing you can think of is it's kind of like the State House in Olympia, where we send representatives from our area to go serve in Olympia to draft laws that impact us. That's what the House of Burgesses was. But it was shut down routinely over time. And some of that is not just because of what's going on in England, but also because of the governor within the colony who was really struggling to allow this process to exist. They were just a little uncomfortable with some of the democracy that was emerging. One of the places that has sort of the largest amount of strife, though, is Massachusetts Bay Colony. And so I'm going to finish off our essential question today talking about Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Bay Colony, as it's oftentimes called, is the colony where the Puritans settled. Think of it as Boston, because Boston today is where the Puritans landed. We looked a little bit at that speech, The City Upon a Hill, and we learned about how, this is challenging, right? This concept of being a city upon a hill really sets these Puritans up for this pretty high set of standards that they have to live by. And there's definitely some complaints that are beginning to exist within Bay Colony. I think it's important to recognize that this is a society that is absolutely based on fear, right? Fear of not living up to a standard, and absolutely fear of damnation, one in which if you behaved poorly, you would go to hell. And some of this is because how the colony operates. So Massachusetts Bay Colony, they were Calvinists. They believed in predestination, meaning at your birth, it was determined whether you would go to heaven or go to hell. Except the thing is, by and large, most people would not know if they were predestined. And so as a result, you had to kind of live in fear, because you certainly wouldn't want to act in such a way that would cause you to go to hell. Instead, you'd want to make sure that you were acting in a holy way, which would have you go to heaven. So there's really no room for individuality. There's no creativity. It's certainly very undemocratic, meaning nobody really has a say. And that's because it's essentially kind of a theocracy, one in which the religious leader is in charge of the government. And there's lots of complaints about this because people are kind of living in fear. On top of that, there's also this philosophy called the elect, or the visible saints, as they were known. And the elect are the people who were going to heaven. How would you know if you were elect? Well, if you had money, then that meant that you were elect. And the philosophy is, well, God gave you your money. Therefore, God must be, in your favor. Poor people, by definition, then, were not in favor with God. And so there was an expectation that you could maybe, if you were really lucky, you could maybe earn your way to heaven. And so there's this expectation in society of whether you are, a non-elect or not visible saint, that maybe you had to keep working harder, just keep working harder, just keep working harder. So there are some folks that don't really buy into this. And there's two really famous folks who we call dissidents. And that is Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams. Now, Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams are both Puritans, both members of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Anne Hutchinson is probably the more famous of the two. She believed that faith in God was enough. Not necessarily, you didn't have to do deeds, you didn't have to prove yourself on a daily basis by doing good things in order to earn a ticket into heaven. She just didn't see it that way. She believed that if one had faith in God, that was enough. She is what we call an antinomian, and that's a big word, I know, but that's the philosophy that faith in God and not deeds will get one a trip to heaven. She is banished because of this. And she later on goes down to create the colony of Portsmouth, which merges with Roger Williams' colonies, we'll talk about here in a second, becomes the colony of Rhode Island. Roger Williams actually was a Puritan minister. He really kind of had this belief that the church could not control people's minds or thoughts. He believed that people had free will and an ability to kind of read the Bible and make decisions about what those words meant. And even as a minister, it would have been his responsibility to tell other people what those words meant, and they would have to accept that at face value. And he really struggled with that concept. So he ends up getting banished himself, and he creates the colony of Providence. Again, merges with Anne Hutchinson's colony, and they form Rhode Island. Overall, I think it's really important to highlight that Massachusetts Bay Colony ends up seeing quite a large amount of immigration occurring. So people are moving into the colony, but those that are coming from England and moving into the colony are not necessarily moving because they share this sort of puritanical belief system, right? The city upon a hill. Instead, they're kind of fleeing the poverty that's emerging in England. There's a lot of economic strife that's happening in England, and so people are moving over to Massachusetts Bay Colony. In U.S. history, we call this the Great Migration. There's two great migrations in U.S. history, and this is one of them. And so as a result, the population starts to increase in Massachusetts Bay. And we see this sort of lack of center in this religious belief. And so there's decreased religious fervor, meaning very fewer and fewer people, right? As more people move in, fewer and fewer people are really buying into this sort of belief system on Puritan society. And so that creates some challenges. So I'm going to stop there. I've hit several terms today as well. Please don't hesitate to email me if you have questions. And when we come together next, we're going to talk about this decreased religious fervor and what it is that Massachusetts Bay decides to do to deal with it.